Hello and welcome back to the General Survey of the Bible. This is Lesson 2, the Introduction to the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the first part of the Bible. The Bible is divided into two major sections, the first being the Old Testament, the other being the New Testament. The Old Testament describes the story of us, the story of people, and the story of the Jewish people in particular. So we're going to take a look at that today. Um, let's get into this first. Talk about the structure of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a series of books. Those books are built on words. They're built on languages. And the primary language of the Old Testament is Hebrew. But you might ask the question, where does this language come from? How is it that the Jews began to speak Hebrew? Where did this language begin? If you're familiar with the ancient Near East, you might know that there are several languages that were already in vogue. First being cuneiform, as you see the picture here on the right. In this picture, you see uh, a clay tablet inscribed with different markings. These are described as the language of cuneiform. It is the most ancient form of writing used by the Sumerians. It is the language of the Tel El Amarna letters, that is, the Egyptian correspondence with Palestine during the time of Akhenaten, the father of Tutankhamun. Now, generally, languages that are spoken in the ancient Near East are Semitic languages. That is, that there are a family of languages used in the ancient Near East called Semitic because of their Semite descendants that use them. This is the family of Shem, one of the three sons of Noah. And so we also see in the mix the hieroglyphic. This is the Egyptian language, that is the pictograms, the Egyptian picture writing not deciphered until Napoleon stumbled across the Rosetta Stone and opened the door to the understanding of the ancient Near East. Egyptian chronology today is considered more reliable than any of the others of ancient cultures, although it isn't the best. Aramaic was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. This was the language of the nation of Aram, which became so commonly used and widespread, both as a common language of all people and a trade language. It was spoken up through and including the time of Jesus, and even in isolated pockets today, it is still spoken. It uses the same alphabet as Hebrew, and is represented in these scriptures you see here, Ezra and Daniel and Jeremiah. And largely those involve foreign correspondence that is included into the scriptures. Well, what about Hebrew? What do we know about Hebrew itself? Hebrew is a language that is specific to Israel. It is believed to be based on Phoenician, which uses a similar alphabet. Some believe that biblical Hebrew was divinely communicated through Moses from God, because it is the only language that is both pictorial and verbal. The pictures are difficult to see with post-Babylonian Hebrew, that is the squared off letters you see there on your screen, but they can be easily seen in the more Phoenician or pre-Babylonian Hebrew. For example, the word bow, represented by these three letters, Kuf, Shin, and Tav. Each of these letters have a particular uh, meaning as word pictures. Kuf, for example, is the back of the head. You can kind of see that in that third letter there on the screen. Sheen is teeth, is a kind of a biting or a finishing move. And Tav here represented as that initial letter. You see, obviously Hebrew is right to left, so I'm describing this for you. That is the t sound. That is the finality, or the sheen being the instruction, sorry. So that the kuf is the sign, or that is the symbol, and the last instruction is the tav sheen, or destruction last. So bow, uh, uh, like a bow for a bow and arrow, as illustrated in Genesis Genesis 8, this bow, or Genesis 9, this bow is a sign that God is not going to destroy the earth again. You can read into that this bow is the sign of the last destruction. That kind of has some implications there. I'll leave it there. This structure is represented several times throughout the Old Testament. For example, in Psalm 119, there are 22 sections. In Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, there's an acrostic of the 22 letters. In Lamentations 1 through 5 is an acrostic of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The Old Testament canon can be understood as 22 books, one for each letter of the Hebrew. Now let's go ahead and move ahead here. Talk about the texts. So where does this Hebrew, the Old Testament as we currently know it, come from? Well, you might be familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are in fact the oldest extant copies of the Old Testament. When we go to do textual analysis, it is important to add or include the Dead Sea Scrolls because they simply represent an older text form than we have as represented in the Leningrad Codex. This is a Biblia Hebraica. This is the common. This is the BHS, the common, the modern Hebrew critical text is based in large part on the Leningrad Codex as its primary source. The Septuagint, the LXX, this is an Old Testament translation into Greek that was initially completed in 185 BC. It's believed that the Septuagint represents an even older text form of the Old Testament than what we see represented in the Leningrad Codex. But then you have the Syriac, the Peshitas, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Talmud, the Mishnah, which are actually comparatively modern understandings of the Hebrew Old Testament. And then you have the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha represents a collection of 11 books that were composed somewhere between the end of the Old Testament, about 550 BC, 450 BC, to about the New Testament period. And you might be familiar with the Maccabees and the books of Esdras, Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Ecclesiasticus, the Prayer of Manasseh, and the Wisdom of Solomon, in addition to those additions that are made to Esther and to Daniel. One I didn't list here is, of course, the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible completed in the 4th century by Jerome. A lot of folks consider that as the best understanding of the Old Testament. Jerome worked with what he had to work with, so we don't really know if that's true or not. This chart gives you some ideas of how some of this began to take place. In Palestine, you had this original collection of writings, the writings of Moses and Joshua and Samuel and so on. And some of those texts were taken to Babylon in 586 BC when the Israelites were taken into exile. And then you have a return here when Ezra formulates the old Palestinian recension. So you see this, here we go through Ezra, and here we have the Alexandrian text, there's the Babylonian text, the Samaritan text here in the middle, and then you bring all three of these back together. By the 2nd century, you have something of a more critical text, until you get down here with the standardization of the Masoretic text about 81, well, that's 81,000. Here they have the Council of Jamnia. That's the Council of Jamnia is what decided officially the canon of the Old Testament. So just you might take a look at that chart, pause it in here or something, and take a look at that. Give you a general idea of how these things began to come together. Talk about the genres here a little bit. The genres include 4, basically: the law, the history, the poetry, and the prophecy. The books of the law are as follows: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 5 books are believed composed by Moses, and they include material from the very beginning, the very first part of Genesis, to Israel getting ready to cross the Jordan into the Promised Land here towards the end of Deuteronomy. Then you have the books of history: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. This is a history of Israel from the time of their crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land to Esther includes the captivity in Persia. Ezra and Nehemiah describe their return from Persia and into the Promised Land, kind of the re-establishment of Israel. The Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles all describe the dynastic period of Saul and David and Solomon and so forth. So these are very important books for us to bridge the gap, really from Old Testament to New Testament. Books of poetry were composed in various times and places. Job being the oldest of them. It's believed Job may have actually been written by a descendant of Esau. Some of the place names and people in his book tend to date him in that area. But he would have been a very early witness outside of the mainstream of the Israelites to describe his world, and it's a very informative book. Psalms written by obviously David, Proverbs by Solomon, as well as Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. There's also some additional material in both these two books, not Solomonic particularly, but important for the Jews to have kept and added to those particular books. Books of prophecy. Now these are the major prophets, and major being they have a lot of material. So Isaiah is the longest at 66 chapters. Jeremiah 52, Lamentations at 5. I think Ezekiel has 42, and then Daniel has 12 or 14, something like that. So these last two, Daniel is especially is the shortest exception of Lamentations, but all of these have a lot to say in comparison to the minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Now these guys all represent different periods in Old Testament history. Jonah himself is referenced in the book of 2nd Kings. They represent different messages. Habakkuk is one of my favorites. We'll get to them when we get to the general survey. Had a beef with God. I look forward to getting into those with you. The setting of the Old Testament is, of course, the ancient Near East, the Mesopotamia, and Egypt, and Babylonia, and of course primarily Palestine right here. Or the New Testament calls that Judea. They called it Canaan back in the day, land of Canaan. So as you can see, there's some places in the New Testament that we cover that gets up over here, but here we have where Abraham is called out of Ur. He goes through Mesopotamia, ends up in Haran, and comes back down here, and he settles. And his descendants make their way to Egypt, and they come back from Egypt. They cross to the Promised Land, and then you have the time of the judges and the kings, some good, some bad, and they get deported to Babylon, and then they get taken over by Persia. So, and then they're finally at last released back to the Holy Land. So there's most of the action that takes place, with the exception of Jonah, takes place all here in this area, which is helpful to us because a lot of these places we can actually go back to and look at. All right, so let's talk about the religions. There's different religions included in the Bible. The Bible's religion theology is monotheistic, whereas nations around them are polytheistic. Although we don't see this appear, the Ra and the Isis and Osiris are over here. Egyptian religion does give us some idea why we see the plagues that God exacts on them. Canaanite religion features prominently, especially in the Judges and the dynastic periods, where the nations around them worship Baal or Baal, whatever you want to call him. And then you have other ancient works that give us information of different perspectives on biblical events, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, as he's represented here. Gilgamesh contained both creation and flood stories, for example. So we have there's different religions that surround the world of the Israelites in the Old Testament. So we just keep that. That's one of those things we just keep in mind. The significance of the Old Testament. Well, now for the Jews, it's obviously very, very significant. The Old Testament was redefined by the Jews after the destruction of Jerusalem in light of 1 Samuel 15:22. I'm going to very quickly bring that up for you. 1 Samuel 15:22. Samuel said, "Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams." Now, the situation that they run into with the destruction of their temple is that there was no place to sacrifice. So they had to come up with a way to continue to absolve themselves of sin without sacrifice. And of course, 1 Samuel 15:22 gave them the way to do that. So the Talmud, the Mishnah, the commentaries all now seek to help establish Judaism as a path of obedience. By ritual and by obedience, they can absolve themselves of sin. Now, for the Christians, we know that Jesus was the first to look at the Old Testament differently. The Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus takes several examples of the Old Testament and brings them forth into a new understanding. Paul says that the law was designed to address sin, especially in Galatians 3:19. Christ came to free us from the law. And Paul says that elsewhere that the whole of Scripture, especially the Old Testament, is inspired by God, and it provides examples for us. I might remind you that Second Timothy passage in 2 Timothy 3:16. Paul explains to us why the Old Testament is so important. Yeah, I had it there. Oh, sorry. He says, "All Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works." Now, at the time he wrote that, he was not talking about the corpus of the New Testament. He was talking about the Old Testament. So for the Christian, especially as you read the Old Testament in light of the New, it helps us to be equipped as people of God. Now, the Restoration Movement, of course, where I hail from, Alexander Campbell's Sermon on the Law in 1916, he says Christ canceled the whole of the law because it was common belief at that time to accept Christ's death as a replacement for sacrifices, but that the rest of the law was to be kept, especially the Sabbath, the fasting, and tithing. Campbell proclaimed that all these, part of the old law, are not binding upon Christians. And Campbell also eliminates distinction between clergy and laity. That is the idea that there are priests, the priest and regular folks. So for us in the Restoration Movement, the idea that the Old Testament, especially with the tithing and the Sabbath days and so forth, these are important, but they're not binding upon us as Christians. So that concludes this lesson 2 on the introduction to the Old Testament. If you follow me next time, we'll get into the Pentateuch. Thanks for sharing.